The bulldozer's blade hit something that shouldn't exist. Clarice Knox had purchased the property 3 weeks ago, spent a fortune on permits, and hired the best demolition crew in the territory. The farmhouse looked like every other abandoned structure dotting the frontier. Rotted wood, collapsed roof, foundations sinking into decades of neglect. It was supposed to be a simple job. Clear the land, lay the foundation, build her legacy. But when the machine's steel teeth tore into the ground behind the main structure, the impact sent a shock wave through the operator's cabin that killed the engine instantly. The crew chief climbed down, his face a mask of confusion. He circled the fresh excavation, looked down into the pit, and went pale. Buried 4 feet below the surface, concealed under packed earth and wild grass, was a door. Not wood, not stone. Steel. Massive, seamless, with a locking mechanism that looked like it could withstand anything. It wasn't just a door, it was a statement. A secret screaming to be kept. Clarice stood at the edge of the pit, the morning sun feeling suddenly cold. She was staring at something that had been hidden deliberately, protected intentionally, kept secret for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. The farmhouse had been worthless. The land was perfect for her development. The timeline was tight but manageable. Everything had been simple until 30 seconds ago. Now, a steel door sat in the middle of her construction site, and the questions multiplying in her mind had nothing to do with building permits or investor presentations. Who builds something like this in the middle of nowhere? What could possibly need this level of protection? And why did every instinct in her body tell her that opening it would change everything? Clarice walked closer, her expensive boots sliding on loose dirt at the pit's edge. The door was nearly 6 feet across, set into a concrete frame that looked decades old, but was structurally perfect. No rust, no corrosion. Someone had maintained this. Someone had cared. The crew chief wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "We can't proceed with this here, ma'am. That's not just a door. That's a vault. You need to call someone." Clarice pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen, then stopped. Call who? The previous owner had died 2 years ago with no family. The property had sat in probate until she bought it at a blind auction. There were no records of underground structures, no permits, nothing in the survey that suggested anything like this existed. It was a ghost made of concrete and steel. She knelt at the edge of the pit, running her hand along the exposed concrete. The surface was smooth, professionally poured, built to last. This wasn't some old storm cellar or forgotten root storage. This was intentional engineering. Expensive engineering. The kind that required planning, resources, and absolute, unwavering secrecy. Her mind raced through possibilities. Smuggling operation? Too remote? Military installation? No markings? A private bunker for some paranoid millionaire? But why here? On land that had been a failing farm for 3 generations. It made no sense. Nothing added up. The sound of an approaching vehicle made her turn. A beat-up truck pulled up the dirt road, moving fast enough to kick up a thick cloud of dust. It skidded to a stop near the excavation site, and a man stepped out before the engine fully died. He was older, maybe 50, with the weathered face of someone who worked outdoors and the rigid posture of someone carrying a weight beyond physical labor. His eyes locked on the exposed door, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Recognition. He walked straight toward Clarice, ignoring the crew entirely. His boots crunched on the gravel with a purpose that set her on edge. "You need to stop right now." His voice was rough but controlled, the kind of tone that expected to be obeyed without question. Clarice straightened, crossing her arms, a familiar wall of defiance snapping into place. "This is my property. I don't know who you are, but you need to leave." The man's jaw tightened. "My name is Royce Bannon. I've lived in this territory my entire life. And that door you just uncovered," he said, his gaze dropping to the steel plate. "It's not yours to open." Clarice felt her patience crack. She was the owner. She had the deed. She had the permits. "I own this land. Everything on it. Everything under it. That makes this door mine." Royce stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, serious rumble that chilled her more than a shout ever could have. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. If you open that door, people will die." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Not might die, will die, and their fate will be on your hands." The words hung in the air like a threat and a warning combined. Clarice's pulse quickened, but she held her ground, refusing to be intimidated on her own land. "Then maybe you should explain what I'm dealing with, because right now, all you are is a man trespassing on a construction site." Royce looked at the door, then back at her, and for the first time she saw something beyond anger in his eyes. Desperation. Pure, uncut desperation. "That door protects people who have nowhere else to go," he said, his voice cracking just slightly. "People who trusted this place to keep them safe. If you expose it, you'll destroy the only refuge they have. And once it's gone, there's no getting it back." Clarice stared at Royce, trying to read the man behind the dire warning. His hands were calloused, the kind that came from years of hard physical work. There was dirt under his fingernails, a carpenter maybe, or a laborer, someone who knew this land better than she ever would. But his eyes carried something deeper than rural familiarity. They carried the weight of secrets kept too long, and the terrifying fear of what happens when those secrets break open into the light. She needed to know what he was protecting. She had to know. But every instinct told her that once she knew, there would be no walking away from it. The simple world of profit margins and construction timelines was already gone. "What kind of refuge?" Clarice kept her voice steady, refusing to show the unease spreading through her chest like a cold stain. Royce glanced at the crew members standing near their equipment, clearly listening in, their curiosity piqued. "Not here," he said, his voice low again. "If you want answers, we talk alone." She considered refusing, asserting control over her own property, her own project. But the raw desperation in his voice had been real, and real desperation usually came from real, terrible consequences. She turned to the crew chief, who was watching them with wide eyes. "Take an early break," she said. "Give us 30 minutes." The man looked relieved to step away from whatever invisible storm was brewing between her and this stranger. He nodded and herded his men back toward their trucks. Royce waited until the crew was out of earshot, the only sound the wind whispering through the dry grass. "This land has been a safe place for over 40 years, he began, his eyes fixed on the door as if seeing through the steel. "People come here when they have nowhere else to run. Women fleeing dangerous situations. Families escaping threats they can't fight. People who need to disappear for a while, just until it's safe to surface again." He finally looked at her, his gaze intense. "That door leads to a shelter underground, stocked with supplies, beds, medical basics. It's saved more lives than you can count." Clarice felt the information settle like a stone in her stomach. It wasn't a bunker. It wasn't a smuggling den. It was something far more complicated. "You're telling me there's an illegal hideout under my property?" Royce's expression hardened. "I'm telling you there's a lifeline under your property. And if you expose it, you'll cut that line for everyone depending on it." She walked to the edge of the pit, staring down at the cold, impassive steel surface. It looked different now. It wasn't just an obstacle. It was a promise of safety. "How many people are down there right now?" Royce hesitated, and that single split-second hesitation told her everything she needed to know. It wasn't a hypothetical. It was happening right now. "There are people inside," he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper. In that moment, her project wasn't just sitting on an undocumented structure. It was sitting on top of an occupied shelter. She hadn't known, hadn't suspected. The survey had been clean, the title had been clear. But none of that pristine paperwork had mentioned the human lives existing 4 feet below ground level. "I have investors waiting on this development," she said, the words coming out of her mouth and sounding hollow and selfish even to her. "Contracts. Deadlines. If I don't move forward, I lose everything I've worked for." Royce didn't flinch. "Then you'll lose everything you've worked for. But at least you won't lose it by destroying people who are already broken." She turned to face him, a flare of anger rising to mask the guilt trying to surface. This was her land, her dream. "You don't get to make that choice for me. This is my investment, my future." His voice stayed calm, but she could see his hands tighten into fists at his sides. "And those are real people down there. Not numbers on a contract, not obstacles to your ambition. People with names and faces and reasons for hiding that would turn your stomach if you knew them." The challenge hung between them, daring her to ask for details, to make it personal, to transform abstract refugees into individual human beings she'd have to look in the eye. Clarice felt the trap in his words. Once she knew their stories, once she saw their faces, the decision would become impossible. She could demolish a structure. She could bulldoze a piece of forgotten infrastructure. But could she destroy a sanctuary for people who had nothing left to lose? Royce took a step closer, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, a stark contrast to his earlier intensity. "Come down there with me. See what you're about to erase. Then make your choice. But make it knowing exactly what you're choosing." Clarice looked from the door to Royce, then to the plans for her future, all of them now cracking apart at the foundation. If she went down there, everything would change. She knew that with absolute bone-deep certainty. But refusing to look wouldn't make the people disappear. It would just make her decision easier to live with. And maybe that was exactly the problem. The steel door opened with a sound like a bank vault unlocking. Heavy, well-oiled mechanisms sliding into place with the precision of something maintained with religious regularity. Royce descended first, his movements practiced and familiar, like a man who had made this journey countless times. Clarice followed, her boots finding the cold metal rungs set into the concrete walls. The air changed as they moved deeper. It grew cooler, stiller, carrying the faint, clean smell of earth and something else she couldn't quite identify. Lamp oil, maybe, or old candle wax. It smelled like time itself. The ladder dropped a full 15 feet before opening into a corridor. It was carved from packed earth and reinforced with thick timber beams that looked like they could hold up a mountain. Electric lanterns, powered by some hidden generator, hung at intervals, their glow steady and warm. Someone had wired this place. Someone had built it to last. The corridor stretched ahead, wider than she'd expected, tall enough to walk upright without stooping. Doors lined both sides, some open to reveal small Spartan rooms with cots and neatly folded blankets, others closed, hiding their secrets. Clarice counted 6 rooms in the first section alone, each one simple but clean and functional. A larger space opened to their right, set up like a common area with a long wooden table, chairs, and shelves stocked high with preserved food, water, and medical supplies. This wasn't a temporary hideout for a night or two. This was infrastructure. Decades of planning and maintenance had gone into creating something that could sustain multiple people for extended periods. This was a community, hidden from the world. A woman appeared from one of the side rooms. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with a small child balanced perfectly on her hip. She froze the moment she saw Clarice, her eyes going wide with something between fear and pure panic. Her body tensed, ready to bolt. Royce raised a hand gently, his voice soft. "It's all right, Willa. She's the new owner. She needed to see." The woman named Willa didn't relax. Not one bit. Her grip on the child tightened, and Clarice could see the frantic calculation happening behind her eyes. The assessment of threat. The measurement of distance to the nearest exit. the preparation to run if necessary. It was the look of an animal that had been cornered too many times. "How long have you been here?" Clarice kept her voice quiet, non-threatening, the way someone might approach a wounded bird. Willa glanced at Royce, a silent question passing between them, before she answered. 3 weeks. We needed somewhere safe while things got sorted out. The child on her hip couldn't have been more than 2 years old. He was small and utterly silent, watching Clarice with a kind of unnerving stillness that came from learning far too early to stay quiet, to not draw attention. His eyes weren't a child's eyes. They were ancient. Royce gestured further down the corridor. There are 4 others currently sheltered. 2 women, 1 older man, and a teenager. All of them here because staying where they were meant danger, or worse. Some stay a few days, some stay months. We don't ask questions. We just provide a place where they can breathe without looking over their shoulder. Clarice felt the weight of what she was seeing press against the ambitious plans she'd made, the future she'd mapped out so carefully. This wasn't an abstract problem anymore. These were faces. These were names. This was a child who couldn't speak, but whose eyes held far too much awareness for his age. She walked further into the shelter, her footsteps echoing softly in the quiet. She passed another room where an older woman sat on a cot, meticulously mending a torn piece of fabric. The woman looked up as Clarice passed, gave a single, slow nod, and then returned to her work without speaking. The silence in this place wasn't empty. It was loaded. It was the kind of profound quiet that came from people who had learned the hard way that noise drew attention, and attention brought terrible consequences. "How do you keep this secret?" Clarice asked, turning to Royce. "How does an entire shelter exist without the territory knowing?" Royce leaned against the corridor wall, his arms crossed over his chest. "People know," he said simply. "The ones who need to know. The ones who might need it someday. But it stays quiet because everyone who benefits from it understands what happens if it gets exposed. It stops being safe. It stops being an option. And then people die because they have nowhere left to run." Clarice turned back toward the entrance, toward the ladder leading up to her construction site, her permits, her investors waiting for progress reports. She'd come down here to see what stood in the way of her project. She'd found something that couldn't be measured in timelines or profit margins. Willa was watching her from across the common area, that silent child still balanced on her hip. And Clarice realized with a jolt that she was being evaluated just as much as she was evaluating. Could this woman with her expensive clothes and her development plans be trusted? Or was she just another threat in a long, painful line of threats that had driven Willa and her son underground in the first place? The question wasn't whether Clarice could demolish this place. She had the legal right, the equipment, and the financial motivation. The question was whether she could live with herself after doing it. And standing in that quiet corridor, surrounded by people who had nothing left except this hidden sanctuary, she wasn't sure she knew the answer anymore. What she did know was that Royce was watching her, and his eyes seemed to hold another secret, something deeper and darker than just the shelter itself. It was a flicker of something else, a shadow she couldn't place, and it made the hair on her arms stand up. There was more to this story. Much more. Clarice climbed back up the ladder into daylight that felt too bright, too harsh, too normal after what she'd just seen. The construction site looked exactly the same as it had 30 minutes ago. But everything had shifted in ways she couldn't reconcile with the plans rolled up in her truck. Her world had tilted on its axis. Her crew was gathered near their equipment, drinking coffee and pointedly avoiding eye contact with Royce, who emerged behind her and closed the heavy steel door with careful, practiced precision. She watched him cover it again with loose dirt and scattered rocks, disguising its presence with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this too many times to count. Within a minute, it was gone again, as if it had never been there at all. "The farmhouse demolition can continue," he said without looking at her, his voice flat. "Just leave the area around the door untouched." Clarice felt a hot, immediate flare of anger. The sheer audacity of it. You think I'm going to build around a secret shelter? You think my investors will just accept that? Royce finally straightened, turning to meet her eyes with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't hostility either. It was something else. Resignation, maybe. I think you're going to do what you can live with, he said quietly. And I think you already know what that is, even if you're not ready to admit it yet. She wanted to argue, to scream, to reassert control over a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her expectations. But the sound of an approaching rider made them both turn. A man on horseback pulled up fast, kicking dust across the site. He looked like he'd ridden hard. He dismounted quickly, pulling a sealed envelope from his saddlebag. "Message for Clarice Knox," he said, his voice breathless. "Urgent. From Marcus Travers." Clarice recognized the wax seal before she broke it open. Marcus Travers, the lead investor, the man whose money was funding this entire development and whose patience was already wearing thin after 2 of her previous projects had fallen through. This was her last chance with him. The letter was written in Marcus's sharp, impatient handwriting. Each word was chosen for maximum impact with minimum waste. Hearing concerning reports of delays at the site. Require immediate explanation and resolution. Project schedule must be maintained. No excuses. The project schedule submitted 3 days ago was aggressive but manageable. That was before she'd found a functioning, occupied shelter under her construction site. The rider tipped his hat and rode off, leaving Clarice standing with a piece of paper that might as well have been a death sentence for her career. She turned to find Royce watching her from across the site. He didn't ask what the message said. He didn't need to. The deadline was written all over her face. She had to choose. The future she'd built her entire career around, or the lives of people she'd just met. She had to decide if she was the kind of person who could bulldoze a sanctuary because it was inconvenient. She had to figure out if there was any possible way to have both. And the answer to that last question was already forming in her mind, bitter and unavoidable. There wasn't. This was binary. Save the shelter or save her project, protect strangers or protect herself. There was no middle ground, no compromise that would satisfy Marcus Travers and keep Willa and her child safe at the same time. Clarice walked back to where Royce stood, her decision still unformed, but the pressure of it building behind her ribs like a physical weight. If I protect this place, I lose everything. My reputation, my investors, every opportunity I fought for. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. And if you destroy it, those people down there lose everything. Their safety, their hope, maybe their lives. So you tell me, he said, his voice dropping low. Which loss can you carry? She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But she could feel a clock starting to count down, and every hour that passed would make the choice harder, the consequences more severe. As she looked at Royce, she saw that same flicker in his eyes again. The shadow. It wasn't just about the people in the shelter. He was hiding something else. Something personal. And she suddenly realized that uncovering his secret might be the only key to surviving hers. Clarice spent that night in the small, dusty boarding house at the edge of town, staring at architectural plans that suddenly felt like a collection of lies. The development she'd designed looked so clean and profitable on paper, all projected revenue and handsome investor returns. But nowhere in those neat, crisp diagrams was there space for the messy, complicated reality of what lay beneath the property. There was no line item for human hope. She'd built her career on being decisive, on seeing opportunities others missed, and on executing without hesitation. She was Clarice Knox, the woman who got things done. But every time she closed her eyes, she didn't see blueprints or profit margins. She saw that small child on Willa's hip, those silent, watchful eyes that had seen too much, too soon. Sleep didn't come. At dawn, she drove back to the site, arriving before her crew. She found Royce already there, sitting on the tailgate of his truck with a thermos of coffee, watching the horizon as if waiting for an enemy to appear. He poured her a cup without asking, and they sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun climb over the empty land. "You've been doing this a long time," she said finally. It wasn't a question. Royce nodded, his gaze fixed on the distance. "My grandfather built that shelter during harder times, back when people needed places to disappear, and asking the wrong questions got you killed. He maintained it until my father took over. Then, it became mine. 3 generations of my family keeping that door hidden and those people safe. 3 generations." The weight of that settled on her. This wasn't just a project for him, it was a legacy, an inheritance of responsibility. "How many people have passed through?" "Too many to count. Hundreds, probably. Some stayed a few days, others stayed months. One woman lived down there for almost a year while things got sorted. She left eventually, started over somewhere new. Last I heard, she was running a successful business 2 territories over. Doing well, living free." He finally looked at her. "That's what the shelter gives people. Time to heal, space to plan, a chance to become something other than a victim." The coffee was strong and bitter, and Clarice let it ground her in the moment. "Marcus Travers isn't going to accept a delay. He's not a patient man. If I don't move forward, he'll pull funding and sue me for breach of contract. I'll lose more than this project. I'll lose my credibility. No one will ever invest in my developments again." Royce set his cup down carefully. "And those people down there will lose their lives. Maybe not immediately, maybe not all at once. But Willa is running from someone who's already put her in the hospital. Twice. The older woman escaped a situation that was slowly killing her in a different way. The teenager down there has absolutely nowhere else to go. You expose this shelter, and they scatter into a territory that's already shown them how cruel it can be. Some of them won't survive it." Clarice felt the weight of his words settle like stones in her chest. She'd come out here this morning planning to ask Royce for help, for a compromise, some magical solution that would save both the shelter and her career. But sitting there in the cold early morning light, she understood with sickening clarity that there was no compromise. This was a choice between 2 futures, and choosing one meant utterly destroying the other. Just then, the sound of approaching vehicles made them both turn. 3 large black trucks pulled up the dirt road, moving fast and kicking up dust. Clarice's stomach dropped when she recognized the lead vehicle. Marcus Travers stepped out before his driver had fully stopped, followed by 2 men in expensive suits who had "lawyer" written all over them. He crossed the site with long, aggressive strides, his expression as hard as granite. "I gave you an ultimatum, Clarice," he said, his voice cutting through the morning air. "From where I'm standing, this site looks exactly the same as it did yesterday." Clarice stood, setting down her coffee, her hand trembling slightly. "We're working on solutions, Marcus. There are complications." Marcus glanced dismissively at Royce, then back at her. "Solutions? I'm looking at an empty field and a crew that hasn't moved an ounce of dirt. I don't need solutions. I need action." She chose her words carefully, acutely aware that Royce was listening, that Willa and the others were 15 feet below them, that everything was balanced on the knife's edge of a decision she still hadn't made. "There's infrastructure on this property that wasn't in the original survey. Moving forward requires careful planning." One of the lawyers stepped forward, pulling out a sleek tablet. "We've reviewed the contracts, Ms. Knox. You have 48 hours to begin active construction, or we initiate proceedings for breach. After that, you'll be liable for all invested capital plus penalties." He looked up from his screen, his eyes cold. "That's $250,000 you'll owe us, and your business license will be suspended pending resolution." The number hit her like a physical blow. $250,000. Money she didn't have. Debt that would utterly destroy everything she'd built. Marcus crossed his arms. "So, Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get that crew working right now. Demolish the farmhouse, clear the land, start the foundation prep. Or, you're going to sign over the property to us and walk away with nothing but a career-ending lawsuit. Your choice. He looked at his watch. But you've got about 60 seconds to make it. Clarice looked at Royce. She looked at the patch of ground covering the steel door. She looked at the future collapsing around her in real time. 60 seconds. 60 seconds to choose who she was going to be for the rest of her life. Then, something else happened. Royce subtly shifted his stance. It was a tiny movement, almost imperceptible, but he moved to stand slightly more in front of the hidden door. It wasn't just a protective gesture, it was possessive. He wasn't just guarding the people. He was guarding the place itself, as if it held something more, something that belonged only to him. And in that moment, she knew her instincts were right. The biggest secret wasn't the shelter. The biggest secret was Royce Bannon. Clarice felt the 60 seconds stretch into something that felt like hours. Every heartbeat was a drum in her ears. Every breath she took was weighted with consequences she couldn't escape. Marcus was watching her with the cold, dead assessment of a man who had made harder decisions than this before his first cup of coffee. The lawyers flanking him already had their tablets out, ready to document whatever happened next. She looked at Royce. His expression remained carefully neutral, a mask of stone, but his hands were clenched so tight that his knuckles had gone white. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to plead. He'd laid out the brutal reality and left the choice where it belonged. With her. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Marcus checked his watch with a deliberate, theatrical slowness. Time's up, Clarice. What's it going to be? Clarice opened her mouth, the words forming that would either save her career or destroy it. But before she could speak, a sound froze everyone in place. A low, metallic groan. The sound of the steel door opening from below. Willa climbed up from the darkness, moving quickly but carefully, that silent child still balanced perfectly on her hip. She shouldn't have surfaced. Coming up into the daylight with witnesses present violated every safety protocol that kept the shelter functioning. It was a desperate, reckless move. But she walked straight toward the group gathered around Clarice's truck, her chin lifted in defiance, even as the fear in her eyes was sharp and clear. "You want to know what's under that door?" she said, her voice shaking but strong. "I'll tell you. It's the reason I'm still alive. It's the reason my son still has a mother. And if you destroy it, you'll be destroying the only thing standing between dozens of people and the situations that nearly killed them." Marcus turned, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the steel door, now plainly visible where Royce's hasty covering had been pushed aside. Then his gaze swung back to Willa. "This is private property. Whatever you're doing down there is illegal occupation." The lawyers were already typing furiously on their tablets, documenting everything, building their case in real time. Willa didn't flinch. "Call it whatever you want. I call it survival. And if that makes me a criminal, then fine. But at least I'll be a living criminal instead of a dead woman who followed all the rules." The child on her hip started to fuss, and she adjusted him with a practiced, gentle ease, her attention never leaving Marcus's face. "You look like a man who's never had to run from anything. Never had to choose between your safety and your pride. Never had to sleep in a strange place because going home meant getting hurt." She gave a small, bitter smile. "Must be nice." Her words landed like accusations, and for the first time, Clarice saw Marcus's cold expression shift. It wasn't sympathy, but it was something. Discomfort, maybe. A flicker of recognition of a world he'd rather not acknowledge existed. One of the lawyers cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "This doesn't change the contractual obligations. The property owner is still liable for the development timeline." Royce finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight. "You want to sue someone? Sue me. I'm the one who's been maintaining that shelter. I'm the one who told her about it. She didn't know it existed until yesterday. Marcus just shook his head, his face hardening again. Doesn't matter. She owns the land. She's responsible for what happens on it. Clarice felt the trap close around her from all sides. Willa, standing there, exposing herself and her child to protect the only safe place she had left. Royce, offering to take the fall for something that had been his family's mission for generations. And Marcus and his lawyers, poised to destroy her financially if she didn't destroy the sanctuary. There was no winning scenario here. No clever solution that saved everyone. Just a choice between which loss she could live with and which one would haunt her forever. She looked at Willa's son, at that small, innocent face that hadn't asked to be part of this fight. And something inside her shifted. Something that had been holding tight to plans and profit margins, and the future she'd mapped out so carefully. Just let go. Maybe some things mattered more than success. Maybe some losses were worth taking if they meant not becoming the kind of person who bulldozed hope because it was inconvenient. Clarice turned to Marcus, her decision made, even though her hands were shaking. I'm not moving forward with the development, not on this site. You want to sue me? Go ahead, but I'm not destroying that shelter. Marcus's face went hard. You're making a massive mistake, Clarice. She nodded slowly. Probably, but it's my mistake to make. And I'd rather be broke and wrong than rich and responsible for what happens to these people if that door stops existing. The lawyers were already typing, documenting her statement, sealing her fate. Marcus stared at her for a long, unblinking moment, then gestured sharply to his men. Let's go. We'll handle this through the courts. As they climbed back into their trucks and drove away in a cloud of angry dust, Clarice felt the crushing weight of what she'd just done settle over her like a shroud. She'd chosen. And now she'd have to live with the consequences. But when she looked at Willa, at the raw relief breaking across that young woman's face, and at Royce's quiet, solemn nod of respect, she thought maybe, just maybe, she could. Then Royce did something strange. After Willa and her son had disappeared back into the shelter, he walked over to the open doorway. Before closing it, he looked down into the darkness, and his expression changed. It became soft, pained. He whispered a single word down into the earth. A name. Eleanor. It wasn't for Willa or the others. It was for someone else. Someone still down there, hidden even from her. The real secret. And Clarice knew she was now tied not just to a shelter, but to a man's hidden heart. The lawsuit arrived within 48 hours. It was delivered by a grim-faced courier to the boarding house where Clarice was still staying, mainly because she couldn't afford to leave and had nowhere else to go. The legal documents were thick and precise, a monument of legalese outlining every clause she'd violated, every timeline she'd missed, every single dollar Marcus Travers intended to extract from her failed business. $250,000, plus legal fees and penalties. Money that might as well have been $1 billion for all the chance she had of paying it. She sat on the edge of the narrow, lumpy bed, reading through accusations that were technically accurate, but missed the entire truth of the matter. She wondered how long it would take before they seized what few assets she had left. Her truck, her savings, her name. Royce found her there that evening. He brought her dinner she didn't want and coffee she desperately needed. He sat in the room's single rickety chair while she picked at food that tasted like dust and ashes. You could fight it, he said, his voice low. Hire a lawyer, drag it out for months, maybe find a technicality in the contract. Clarice shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. With what money? I'm broke, Royce. Everything I had was tied up in that development. My equipment's already been repossessed. My crew moved on to other jobs. And in about 3 weeks, Marcus's lawyers will own anything I haven't already lost. He leaned back, studying her with that quiet, unnerving intensity she'd come to recognize. So, what are you going to do? I have no idea, she said. the words sounding defeated even to her own ears. Go back to working for someone else, I guess. Start over from nothing. Spend the next decade of my life paying off a debt from a project that never happened because I chose my conscience over common sense. She'd made her choice. She would stand by it. But that didn't make the consequences any easier to swallow. Royce pulled a worn leather folder from inside his jacket and set it on the small table between them. I've been asking around, talking to people who've used the shelter over the years. People who got back on their feet, built new lives, made something of themselves after they left. Clarice looked at the folder without touching it. Why? Because they want to help, he said simply. When I told them what you did, what you gave up to keep that door protected, they started reaching out. Some of them sent money. Small amounts mostly. $20 here, $50 there. But it adds up. She hesitantly opened the folder. It was filled with crumpled envelopes and cash, and handwritten notes were attached to many of the donations. From someone you saved without ever meeting. From a woman who owes you her life. For the person who chose us over profit. The amounts were modest individually, but together they represented something larger than money. They represented every person who'd passed through that shelter, every life that had been protected because 3 generations of Royce's family had maintained a secret sanctuary. And now, because she'd refused to destroy it. It won't be enough to pay off Marcus, she said, the reality of her situation still a heavy weight. No, Royce agreed, shaking his head. But it's enough to start something different. I've been thinking. That property still belongs to you, at least until the lawsuit settles. The farmhouse is still standing, and there are people in this territory who need what you can offer, if you're willing to rethink what success looks like. Clarice met his eyes, saw the beginning of an idea forming in the space between them. What are you suggesting? He leaned forward, his voice filled with a new energy. Turn the property into something legitimate. Not a development, a sanctuary, official, legal, a place where people can come when they need help, get connected with resources, find temporary shelter while they figure out their next steps. Partner with organizations that already do this work. Make it sustainable. You've got the land. You've got the skills to manage a project. And now, he said, tapping the folder, you've got a reputation as someone who will fight for people who can't fight for themselves. That means something out here. Clarice felt the possibility of it settle into her chest. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was real. It would take time. It would take money she didn't have and support from a community that barely knew her. But it was a path forward. A path that didn't require her to become someone she'd hate. It was a purpose built on the foundation of the very choice that had ruined her. Maybe that was worth more than the future she'd lost. She looked at the folder again, at the notes from strangers who had now become stakeholders in her redemption. If we do this, we do it right. No shortcuts, no hiding. Everything legal and documented. Everything legal and documented. Royce nodded. But first, we need to deal with Marcus. Because if he takes the land in the lawsuit, none of this matters. He paused, and his expression grew dark. And there's something else you need to know about Marcus. He's not just an investor. Clarice waited. The man Willa is running from, Royce said, his voice grim. Her ex-husband. He's one of Marcus Travers's top lieutenants, a business partner. The room went cold. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a connection. Marcus didn't just want the land for a development. He wanted to bulldoze the shelter to get to Willa, to erase the one place she could hide from his man. This wasn't business. It was personal. It was a hunt. And Clarice had just put herself right in the middle of it. The courthouse in the nearest town was small and functional, built from stone that had weathered decades of territorial disputes and legal battles. Clarice sat at the defendant's table with a public defender she'd hired using a fraction of the donated funds, a young man who looked earnest, but hopelessly outmatched. She knew it probably wasn't enough, but she had to try anyway. Marcus Travers sat across the aisle with his expensive, shark-like legal team. He looked confident and completely unmoved, as if this was merely a tedious piece of paperwork he had to get through. The judge was an older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, and the kind of commanding presence that suggested she'd seen every trick and argument the legal system could produce. She reviewed the case files with methodical precision while Clarice's heart hammered against her ribs. Marcus's lead attorney stood first. He laid out the breach of contract with surgical clarity. The timeline violations, the failure to perform, the significant financial damages his client had suffered. It was a damning and entirely accurate presentation, and Clarice felt the weight of it pressing down like a sentence already delivered. Then her lawyer stood, and instead of arguing technicalities, he did the only thing he could. He called Royce Bannon to testify. Royce walked to the witness stand with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout this entire ordeal. And under oath, he told the truth. He spoke about the shelter, about its long history, about the hundreds of people who had survived because it existed. And he told them about the choice Clarice had made, what she had sacrificed to keep it protected. The judge listened without interrupting, her expression completely unreadable. When Royce finished, Clarice's lawyer called Willa to testify. She came forward, carrying her son. In a voice that shook but never broke, she described what that shelter meant, not in abstract terms, but in the concrete reality of her life. The bruises that had healed there, the constant, gnawing fear that had slowly dissolved into something that felt like hope, the chance to rebuild a life that she wouldn't have had anywhere else. Marcus's attorney objected twice, arguing relevance, but the judge overruled him both times and let Willa speak her truth. When the testimony concluded, the judge looked directly at Clarice. "Do you have anything to add, Ms. Knox?" Clarice stood, feeling the weight of every decision that had brought her to this moment. "Your Honor, I violated the contract. That's true. I failed to meet the timeline. That's also true. But I did it because destroying that shelter would have meant destroying the safety of real people, with real names and real lives. I'm not asking to be excused from the consequences. I'm just asking that the court understand why I made the choice I did. I chose people over profit, and I would make the same choice again." The judge nodded slowly, made a note on her legal pad, and then did something unexpected. She looked over at Marcus Travers. "Mr. Travers, this court is aware of your business association with Mr. Elias Thorne." A flicker of surprise, quickly hidden, crossed Marcus's face. Elias Thorne, Willa's ex-husband. "This court is also aware," the judge continued, her voice like ice, "that Mr. Thorne has a pending arrest warrant in the next territory for aggravated assault against his former wife, Ms. Willa Hayes." She looked at Willa, then back at Marcus. "Given these facts, your aggressive desire to demolish this specific property, which you now know to be a shelter for people in her exact situation, could be viewed as problematic. It could be seen as aiding and abetting a fugitive from justice by attempting to eliminate his victim's only known refuge." The courtroom was silent. Marcus's lawyer was on his feet, sputtering objections, but the judge silenced him with a single glare. She called for a brief recess. 30 minutes felt like an eternity. When court reconvened, the judge delivered her ruling with the swift efficiency of someone who had already made up her mind. The breach of contract is clear. However, the circumstances surrounding that breach involve significant humanitarian considerations, as well as potential criminal obstruction. I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff regarding financial damages, but I am reducing the amount to actual documented losses, not projected profits. The penalty is set at $75,000. Clarice felt the air rush back into her lungs. It was still a massive debt, but it was one she might actually survive. Furthermore, the judge continued, her eyes fixed on Marcus, Ms. Knox will retain ownership of the property, provided she establishes the proposed sanctuary as a legal, non-profit entity within 6 months and maintains its operation for a minimum of 5 years. Failure to do so will result in the immediate transfer of the property to the plaintiff. As for you, Mr. Travers, I suggest you consider very carefully who you choose to do business with in the future. Court adjourned. Marcus stood, his face a thundercloud. He buttoned his jacket and walked past Clarice without a word. But as he reached the door, he paused and looked back at her. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. I haven't decided which. Then he was gone. Clarice was left standing in a courthouse that had just given her a second chance she hadn't entirely expected. Outside, Royce was waiting on the steps. Willa stood beside him, that small child still balanced on her hip. Others had gathered too. People Clarice didn't recognize, but who clearly knew about the shelter, about what it meant, about what she'd fought to preserve. An older woman approached and pressed a folded envelope into her hand. For the sanctuary, she whispered. So others can have what I had. A man in work clothes nodded as he passed. You did right. More envelopes followed, small donations from people who'd survived because a door had stayed hidden and protected for decades. Clarice looked at Royce, at the property deeds still in her name, at the future that looked nothing like what she'd planned, but somehow felt more solid, more real than any blueprint she'd ever drawn. We've got 6 months, she said. He smiled, a rare and genuine thing. Then we'd better get started. She walked down those courthouse steps knowing she was broke, in debt, and facing the hardest project of her life. But she also knew that the shelter would continue protecting people who needed it. That Willa's son would grow up in a world where sanctuary existed. And that she'd become someone who chose humanity over ambition when it mattered most. Maybe that was worth more than any development she could have built. Maybe that was the kind of success that actually meant something. If you want to see more stories where courage and conscience collide, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support means everything, and it helps us bring you more tales where ordinary people make extraordinary choices.